From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. My guest today is someone who has played an important role in my pursuing the creation of the Optimism Institute. After reading one of his books and watching his 2018 TED Talk, Is the World Getting Better or Worse? A Look at the Numbers, I was encouraged to believe that helping spread the messages he espouses would be a worthwhile endeavor. His name is Steven Pinker. Steven is an experimental psychologist who conducts research in visual cognition, psycholinguistics, and social relations. He grew up in Montreal and earned his BA from McGill and his PhD from Harvard. Currently Johnstown Professor of Psychology at Harvard, he's also taught at Stanford and MIT. He's won numerous prizes for his research, his teaching, and his books, which include The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Sense of Style, and Enlightenment Now. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Humanist of the Year, a recipient of 9 honorary doctorates, and one of Foreign Policy's World's Top 100 Public Intellectuals, as well as Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World Today. He was chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary and writes frequently for the New York Times, The Guardian, and other publications. His 12th book, published in 2021, is called Rationality: What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, Why It Matters. So it goes without saying that it's an honor to host Dr. Pinker on the Blue Sky Podcast, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Steven Pinker, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Steven, you've worked on a wide range of fields in psychology, including deep dives on language, vision, human relations. How did you get to the subject of spreading the news that the world is actually getting better? How did that spark your interest?
Anyone who advocates a rich theory of human nature, that is, the theory that we are not blank slates, immediately faces the worry that that will doom us to all of the social sins and harms and troubles that we're faced with now, and that there's no hope for improvement. You can't change human nature, as the saying goes. If you advocate that we have a rich endowment from our evolutionary legacy, does that mean that we have a genes for war or a innate selfishness or exploitativeness? And so there's a resistance even to the scientific hypothesis that anything is inherent to human nature, from the political fear that that would make hopes for improvement futile, a waste of time. So I pointed out in my book, The Blank Slate, and even before that in How the Mind Works, that there's, in fact, nothing in the proposal of a rich human nature that rules out social progress. First of all, because the mind is extraordinarily complex, and even if we do harbor inclinations toward greed and competitiveness, and dominance, revenge, sadism, lust, and so on, that's not all there is in the mind. We also have a capacity for self-control, for empathy, for cognitive problem solving, for moral norms. And indeed, the cognitive component, as we externalize it through language, is infinite in scope. We can have ideas about our ideas about our ideas. We can combine old ideas into new ones in an explosive number of ways. So there's no inherent constraint on our thinking up solutions to our problems, some of those problems being our own nature. Moreover, not only is it theoretically possible, but if you look at the course of history, it's actually happened. The slavery was abolished, and criminalization of homosexuality, and the Soviet Empire collapsed with virtually no violence. Rates of homicide had come down since records were first kept in the Middle Ages. So there can't be a debate over whether progress is possible. It's happened. When I made that observation in a blog post one year, I then got a set of papers by email and commentaries by people in a variety of fields that said, oh, you could have added to your examples of violence having declined over the centuries. I was told that rates of death from war had come down significantly since the late 1940s, that homicide has declined in every country for which there are records going back several centuries, that child abuse is in decline, domestic violence, rape, the bullying and kids picking on each other, all of them have gotten better. And that kind of vindicates the idea that there's nothing in our nature that prevents us from improving our lot. Now, we may never be able to have a perfectly harmonious utopia, an age of Aquarius, but we can worry about that when we've cut the rate of violence down by half and then half again. Whether we can ever get to zero is a problem for our descendants. We shouldn't try to get it to zero, but we should try to get it much lower than it is now.
And despite studying this and knowing these facts of incredible world improvement, you resist the label optimist. When people say you're an optimist, you resist that a little bit. Why is that?
Well, optimism is a dimension of temperament. It's largely heritable, as are most dimensions of personality and character and temperament. And why should you take an assessment of the world seriously just because of the some guy is in a good mood a lot of the time? Maybe you're not in a good mood a lot of the time, but if you're a scientist, there should be facts about the world that don't depend on your temperament or your inclination. And what I do and what surprises people and what they confuse for optimism is simply presenting a view of the world and of history that's based in data rather than stories and narratives and anecdotes. The problem with storytelling or anecdote provision, or for that matter, journalism, is that it's a non-random sample of the worst things that happen on Earth. And so it gives you a misleading impression because the good things either consist of things that don't take place, like a region of the world that hasn't had any wars, or often things that change by a few percentage points a year, which can compound changing the world, but that never unfold on a particular day or a particular year, giving journalists and historians something to write about.
Right. Bad news happens very quickly and very dramatically. These good news, it takes sometimes generations to actually see it and track it and know it's happening.
Indeed. Or you see it if the denominator of your fraction is all the opportunities for something to happen, and your numerator is the bad things that do happen. Then if the number of bad things diminishes as the number of opportunities stays the same or even increases as population increases, that is a sign of how far we have come or are coming. That's completely invisible if you simply follow events and images.
And I interviewed Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, and one of the things he said about bad news selling or staying in our mind better than good news is that, I'd be curious your take. He said that the brain is good at detecting difference, and that it's kind of reassuring to me. He said, the vast majority of things that happen in the course of a day or our lives are good, but our brain detects the things that are outliers and different, the bad stuff. Does that ring true to you?
Well, yes, we are. There is a negativity bias in human psychology. We remember bad things more than good things, at least in the recent past. With the passage of time, even though we remember bad events, we tend to forget how bad they were at the time. So the emotional coloring changes even if the memories stay. But certainly in the recent past, we are more attentive to negative things. We're more stung by hurts than we are buoyed by praise. There are more words for negative emotions than positive emotions, presumably reflecting the reality of our emotional spectrum. So yeah, there is a built-in tendency to focus on the negative, amplified by the inherent nature of journalism and history.
I appreciated hearing Stephen describe how he arrived at the conclusion that human beings are capable of making continuous progress. Yes, he says, we have in our nature tendencies towards violence, selfishness, and other ugly characteristics, but we also have within us a cognitive component that he describes as infinite in scope. And because of that, we are capable of rising above these bad impulses. I also like the way he talks about whether he is naturally himself an optimist. I've asked others whether they think optimists are born or made, and Stephen points out that his own positive view of the world comes not from his personal makeup, but instead from a scientist's appreciation for empirical facts and data. He also points out that he's not always in a good mood. And by the way, dear listeners, neither am I. But when we do get down, it can be helpful to pull ourselves back up by taking stock in our own surroundings and taking a broader view that reminds us of so much that's right with the world. Getting back to our conversation, I wanted Stephen to talk about why we are so prone to glorifying the past to the detriment of our ability to appreciate the present. And you've also used the term hindsight bias, and I was a history major. I love history, and it really frustrates me sometimes how people will say, and you reference this in a TED Talk, that 2016 was the worst year in American history. I'm like, seriously?
Yeah.
And Kevin Kelly, I think, said, if you read the news, you'll think that things have never been worse. If you read history, you realize things have never been better. And I don't understand. You're in an academic setting. What is it about our inability to help place today in terms of history and just how much better we are doing? The idea that for all that might have happened in 2016, that more than a few people, I checked editorials, described it as the worst year in American history. What does that say about us and how we think?
Well, there's another phenomenon in addition to our cognitive psychology and our memory, and that's our social competition. And I think Thomas Hobbes said it best more than 350 years ago. He said, competition of praise inclineth toward a reverence of antiquity, for men contend with the living, not with the dead. Which is to say, to criticize the present is a way of criticizing your rivals. So if you want to set yourself apart from people and say that I'm superior to all of my fellows, you point out how terrible things are, how much everyone else has been screwing things up, and the past is a point of reference. Namely, look how much worse my contemporaries, my rivals, my competitors have made things. And this is especially true among intellectuals and academics, which often take an adversarial stance toward the institutions of their country, toward the business, government, the military, religion, civil society organizations, where there's an unarticulated but I think widely felt view that society is inherently, or at least modern American society is inherently evil, corrupt, oppressive, that nothing short of tearing it down and starting over with something completely different can fix the problems. If and as part of that narrative, you have to say that things have gotten worse. There's no way that they'll become better. There is, of course, a version of that even though that's concentrated on the academic and intellectual left. In the last 6 or 7 years, we've also seen a version of it on the right in the Make America Great Again movement. The idea that we're living in a time of carnage and decay, and that, again, you've got to drain the swamp, you've got to completely burn it all down and start over with something new. That's, even though I don't think that many academics would say that, if you press them, that's often what they are committed to.
And you've said too, I don't want to call it necessarily intellectual snobbery, but maybe that's what it is. You said once, people falsely equate pessimism with moral seriousness. That if you're an optimist, you must just be a dope, and if you're really smart and really studying, you'd be a pessimist. Is that a way to describe it?
Yes, I think it was Morgan Housel who said that pessimists sound like they're trying to help you, optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something.
Right. Yes. No, it's true, but it's difficult. In your 2018 TED Talk, which I have recommended to so many people, and it had a huge influence on the work that I'm doing and the inspiration for me doing this, millions of views. I think your best laugh line, because it clearly struck a chord, was when you said that progressives don't like acknowledging that there's been progress. So clearly that resonated with people. What's that all about?
I said intellectuals hate progress. Intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress.
Why is that?
Again, it's acknowledging. I think there's an unstated but widely felt feeling among intellectuals, and this goes back to the 19th century. The Western civilization is in decline. It's been circling the drain. Of course, that people have been saying that for more than 100 years, and it's 150 years. It's still around. A lot of the all-stars in the intellectual pantheon are morose cultural pessimists. Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Sartre and Foucault, just about all the intellectuals that are assigned to college freshmen have been predicting the end of that civilization is corrupt and decadent and circling the drain. So that's part of the religion of the intellectuals. And again, I think to put a rather uncharitable spin on it, I think it's largely because the different elites in society are in inherent competition with one another. There's a widespread contempt among intellectuals for government, for technocrats, for engineers, for the military, for business. And there's a feeling of moral superiority to being an artist, an intellectual, a professor. And part of that is not acknowledging that the people in charge have done anything right.
Now you're saying these things not from outside the walls of the kingdom. You are arguably at the epicenter of a lot of what you just described. You teach at Harvard University.
Yeah, I'm a Harvard professor, right?
You are a Harvard professor. So how does that feel? I mean, I know from being around there that you tend to take issue with a lot of what you hear, both from your colleagues, and then I'd also like to hear about what the mood is like with students in terms of. I interviewed Charles Kenny, who's someone you turned me on to, just a brilliant guy, and he described this generation as the most tolerant in world history. And then he caught himself. He said, with the exception of that whole speech thing. And
Yeah.
I'd love to know your thoughts on that, what it's like for you to be on that campus in the middle of all these things that you have some issues with.
Yeah, well, I've recently joined with several of my colleagues to form a council on academic freedom at Harvard. Because we've, not just at Harvard, I don't think Harvard is the worst by any means, but we've seen across universities a rather surprising culture of censorship and intolerance and character assassination, all in the supposedly in the service of social justice, of combating racism and transphobia and homophobia and misogyny, but which in fact largely consists of trying to tear other people down. And despite the professed aim toward equality, the effect has been to drive a lot of women out of science and out of academia if they depart from party lines, say, on transgender issues. Likewise, it's often been African American scholars who, despite all of the publicity about fighting racism, if an African American scholar is, like any independent scholar, takes his or her own stance on a controversial issue, then then they can get canceled or fired. Now, I wrote about this in the Boston Globe op-ed with Bertha Madras that announced the formation of this council. But who cares what happens at Harvard? Well, for one thing, a lot of people apparently do, I've learned. Yeah. But whether or not they do, and maybe because they do, this can be a kind of part of a larger movement for starting with professors, but also including students, because a lot of students are getting sick and tired of being told to shut up and that they can't say this and they can't say that. But at least we're professors, so that's where we begin to push back against administrators who are too easily intimidated and cowed by protests or by the fear of being accused of being racist or transphobic, who just want to make trouble go away. They need demonstrators like they need a hole in the head, and so they'll just dispense whatever verbiage makes things settle down. So we're going to be a kind of pain in the neck from the other direction. We're also going to try to remind the community, students and administrators, of why freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech, academic freedom are good things, not because it's a matter of professors have rights, Whether or not they do, the point is that none of us can ever achieve progress, including progress in understanding the world, unless we can try out hypotheses and see which ones are right or wrong. If there's an orthodoxy, if there's a dogma, most ideas are wrong. We're very lucky when we find one that works. We try things out. Most of the dominant orthodoxies at any time are going to be largely wrong. Unless you can criticize them, how will we know? You just are guaranteed to lock yourself into error. And it's a especially poignant problem for academia because we're granted all these privileges by the wider society, the tax-free status, in the case of state universities, direct government support, government scholarships, even for private universities, tolerance of exponentially increasing tuition that families have to work themselves to the hilt to afford. Yeah. What are we giving back in return for all of those perks? Well, ideally, it is knowledge, discovering it and passing it on to the next generation. If we've self-handicapped that very process by just enforcing an orthodoxy, then we're kind of ripping society off.
And I've always thought, too, if you can't have that kind of debate in an academic setting, where can you have it?
Ironically, you can have it in a lot of places outside academia. My friend, the civil liberties lawyer Harvey Silverglade, says you can say things in Harvard Square that you can't say in Harvard Yard.
The point that Stephen makes here about undermining our rivals by criticizing the present is interesting, and it makes complete sense to me. And it's also kind of amazing to hear a prominent professor at Harvard express concern that higher education might be, as he says, ripping society off. He goes into greater detail on this in the Boston Globe op-ed he references. It came out in April of 2023 if you'd like to check it out online. It's pretty thought-provoking. What got my attention most in this part of the conversation, though, was his assertion that most ideas are wrong. I'd never thought of it that way, but if you accept that as the case, it stands to reason that keeping discourse broadly open is a way to be sure we don't hang on to the wrong ideas forever. Back to our conversation, I wanted Stephen to comment on why these issues seem to be so particularly contentious today. Why now? Why is this such an acute issue? Why has it become such a big issue in the last, 10 years or so? There was always, when I was in school, I'm in my late 50s, I think the term political correctness first started and people got a little bit guarded, but it is way different today than it was then. Why? What is it about our society that's led us to this place?
Well, it has been growing. I mean, I saw the seeds of it when I was an undergraduate. I'm a bit older than you. And there were absolutely protests, attempts to silence speakers, claims that, quote, fascists don't have the right to speak. The term political correctness has been around at least since the early 80s, and it exploded into public consciousness with a cover story in Newsweek magazine, which I think was around 1990. So we're talking about, that's 33 years ago. So it seems to be kind of a one-way ratchet, at least in academia, where possibly because the baby boomers are now the deans and the presidents, and so they're indulging the younger students, although it is worse and worse the younger the cohort. Partly it's because a combination of values that justly denigrate racism and sexism and transphobia and homophobia. Those really are bad things, but it has a weapon to people who want to smear or neutralize or cancel their rivals by hurling around these crippling epithets. So we've kind of handed out a weapon. It's magnified by social media because you can easily whip up an outrage mob. Between now and tomorrow, I could easily get 600 signatures. The universities have become more corporatized, and they are afraid of bad publicity. And their chief counsel often kind of sets university policy by telling presidents what they can and can't do. Because of federal mandates, diversity and protection against sexual harassment, there's an absolutely exploding bureaucracy of diversity bureaucrats, each one of whom has a staff and a chief of staff, and each within a university, every school of engineering has one, and the school of public health has one, and the law school has one of these offices, and they need something to do. And in fact, there's not a whole lot of actual racism on university campuses. If you attribute every statistical difference between races and ethnic groups to racism, then you can find it by definition, because no two groups are ever identical. But to keep themselves in existence, this bureaucracy will find incidents or statements, whether they are significant or not, and they themselves don't have any part of the mandate of the university to discover and transmit knowledge. That's just not their job description, not their department. As they gain power, they can shut down the rest of the university.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I'm even asking about this, given the subject of this podcast, is I worry that it does impact people's mental health. That this, whether you want to say walking on eggshells or just not feeling like you can express yourself, or frankly thinking that approaching a conversation instead of assuming best intentions, getting ready for the worst, to me is just not a healthy way. And you're a psychology professor, so you know a lot more about this than I do, but I just worry that it contributes to young people's sense of well-being.
Oh, I suspect you're right, that you've got the paradox that these kids thrown into dorms with their peers, kind of a luxury that I didn't grow up with in going to school in Canada, where I lived with my parents, as Canadians do, as people all over the world do. But here they're surrounded by peers. It's like party time 7 days a week. They say they're lonely. They're lonely. Well, they're lonely because the minute they set foot on campus, there is an army of bureaucrats giving them orientations in which they say, if you ask one of your students, where are you from, that's racist. That's a microaggression. If you say, what languages do you speak? If you, they set out campus life as a kind of minefield of opportunities to be smeared as a bigot, and so they clamp up. They stay in their rooms. They're told that if the romance and sexuality are just traps to be accused of harassment and rape, and so much easier to watch porn, and but not a recipe for mental health. On top of that, they are told, and again, I'm not blaming them, I'm blaming us. They're told the species is doomed by 2050. The humans are going to be extinct. They naturally conclude, first of all, well, I'm not going to have children and bring them into a world where they're going to live through it. And also, how much of a positive attitude toward life are you going to have if you're told things are getting worse and worse, that you're constantly being victimized, you're being traumatized? There's a significant part of the mental health industry is kind of glorifies trauma and abuse. That's the way you gain status. Everyone's a victim. Everyone has been abused. Everyone suffers from trauma. That's kind of become part of our popular culture. It's almost as Greg Lukianoff and John Haidt have pointed out, it's the exact opposite of the one form of therapy that we know is effective, namely cognitive behavior therapy, which encourages people to distance themselves from their emotions, not to constantly take their hurts seriously, but to put them into perspective, to have a sense of agency, to figure out what can I do about things, to not see the world as black and white, good and evil, with them on the side of good. All of these basic lessons of cognitive behavior therapy are being turned upside down in the current culture of trauma and victimhood.
And back to Charles Kenny talking about this being such a tolerant generation, I worry that it almost goes against that it almost breeds a different kind of intolerance that wouldn't be there but for the influence, it sounds like, of the university.
Well, yes, it's like as Tom Lehrer said in the introduction to his mordant song National Brotherhood Week, I know there are people who do not love their fellow man, and I hate people like that.
Steven Pinker has clearly developed some very strong opinions here, And I imagine there are some of you listening who are uncomfortable with some of what he has to say. The first thing I'd point out is that it's clear to me that he does care about racism, homophobia, sexual assault, and the other important issues the college administrators are trying to confront. His concern is more with the way this is being done and the potential impact it's having on young people in the college setting. I have no personal experience with what college orientations are like these days, and I'd love to hear from any listeners who have a different take on what the professor has to say. But again, if there's anything going on that, despite best intentions, is creating a feeling of isolation and loneliness, then we at least should be open to discussing the situation and possible solutions. For the final part of our talk, I wanted to get back to some of the positive historical trends that Stephen has described in his writing and speeches. And I asked him which of these tend to be the most surprising to his audience. So back to these trends that you're so good about pointing out to people about how the world is getting better. Are there any particular that you roll out and people are the most surprised by, whether it's violence, life expectancy, all these trends that so many of us take for granted? Are there some that you like to talk about that people, question or Google or challenge or just can't believe?
There's often a incredulity that modernity is more peaceful than ancient times, including cultures beyond the range of government and civilization, hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists and pastoralists, that their rates of violence were far higher than what we see in the 20th century, or even in the 20th century with its world wars. There's incredulity that many measures of the environment have improved, at least in affluent countries, that waterways are becoming cleaner, that many species are rebounding. There's often incredulity even that in the range of climate forecasts, that the worst of them is seeming increasingly unlikely. These are the ones that get the most publicity and that assume that we'll continue to burn coal forever or expand coal burning. But it seems that the world is starting to move away from coal, and that this is not to say that we're on track to solving climate change. We're not, but we're not on track to civilizational collapse.
Yeah, and on rates of violence, and particularly war, as awful and tragic and terrible as the conflict in Ukraine is right now, I think the fact that it feels like such a terrible exception tells you how much better things have gotten. I recently spoke to a group of high school students and explained, my grandfather fought in World War I, his oldest son fought World War II, my dad fought in Korea, and that's just how it used to be.
Yeah, and you just missed perhaps being drafted to Vietnam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My oldest brother missed the draft by 3 years, and for all the things that today's generation says my generation left them with, we didn't leave them with a draft and a war that they're all worried about going to fight. So I think even something like the Ukraine war, again, it's awful, and I hope there's a peaceful solution to it. It is an exception, whereas 100 years ago, these would have been more the norm.
Oh, yes. Well, in fact, 100, or at least 150. So 100 years ago was after World War I, when the tide kind of started to change, not enough to prevent World War II, obviously. But there was a huge change in much of the world, much of at least the literate developed world, away from the idea that war was good. In the 19th century, war was not a bad thing. It was a good thing. It called forth heroism and manliness and spirituality and dedicating yourself to a cause. And you had artist after artist and writer after writer saying that the worst thing that could happen would be peace, because then we would be decadent and effeminate and consumerist and selfish, and that war is necessary to bring forth all of the spiritual, heroic, glorious, manly qualities. One of my heroes, the namesake of the building that I work in at Harvard, William James, wrote a famous essay called The Moral Equivalent of War, by which he had in mind not something that would be as bad as war, but something that would be as good as war, but without all the killing. And he basically anticipated what we today call the Peace Corps, Teach for America, voluntary service. He thought that young people should be drafted into constructive, peaceful service, so that it would call forth all of the spiritual, heroic, altruistic qualities that in his era were thought to be best satisfied through war. Now, where we turned a corner wasn't so much John and Yoko and Peter, Paul and Mary and Pete Seeger in the 60s, although that had an effect. But World War I and the recoil against the unprecedented destruction of that war suddenly made the idea that war was heroic and beautiful and glorious and spiritual and thrilling look a little ridiculous.
It's interesting you mentioned draft for public service. My late father would have been a big supporter of that. And one of his things was that if you really want to achieve diversity in any group of people, go back to a mandatory draft. He grew up in upstate New York and Vermont. The first time he shook hands with a black person was at basic training to go to Korea. And that as hard as universities try, a mandatory draft would do a better job.
It could be true. And of course, the military was the first institution that was systematically desegregated. You asked why there's so much more intellectual intolerance. And one of the plausible explanation is that there's increasing segregation by level of education, that people with a college degree, especially a postgraduate degree, just don't talk to people with just a high school diploma anymore. They don't live with them. They don't go to church with them. They don't serve in the military with them. They aren't members of the Knights of Columbus or the Sons of Italy or the International Order of Odd Fellows or the Kiwanis Club or the Rotary. And with the decline of all of these class-bridging organizations, people are more likely to sort themselves into mutually hostile tribes.
Well, you've been very gracious with your time. And so to wrap up, I'm going to ask you one last very self-serving question. In your 2018 TED Talk, which I will recommend again, you said something about how it's frustrating that more people aren't aware of all these positive trends, and you wish, maybe there's someone out there who could be more articulate about it, more passionate about it. I'm making this my full-time mission. So what advice do you have for a guy like me, a voice out in the wilderness, trying to spread this story that, yes, we have huge challenges ahead of us. Climate change is real. Nuclear threat is serious, but that things are getting better. And if we stay optimistic and believe that we personally can make a difference in continuing this progress, the world's going to be better. What advice do you have for someone like me to actually make a difference?
Well, certainly to align this thrust with the successes of the past, of the decriminalization of homosexuality, and then the passage of gay marriage, the ending of the draft, the reduction of war, the advancement of women's rights, to also remind people this isn't just a mental mindset, it's based on data, and that the data revolution should inform our understanding of the world, and it shows that we have wrought improvements, empowering us and emboldening us to try for more, and of course to acknowledge things that did not go well. That there was a great increase in crime starting in the 1960s and violence that only started to go down in the 1990s. There was a big increase in civil wars in the 1960s and 1970s that's since mostly come down. But to acknowledge that this isn't some mystical force, it depends on human agency. That problems are inevitable. We have no right to a utopia. The fact that there are problems doesn't mean things have gotten worse, because yesterday's problems were worse.
Terrific. And on that note, I want to thank you so much for your time today, but more importantly, for your example, for your work. You really inspired me, and I can't thank you enough for taking time to be on the show.
My pleasure, Bill. Good luck with all your efforts.
Thank you. When talking about the incidence of war decreasing over the years, I appreciated Stephen pointing out how, for most of human history, war was glorified and even hoped for as an opportunity for adventure, to demonstrate valor, and even to provide the opportunity for social advancement. Never wanting to miss a chance to quote from Lin-Manuel Miranda's Tony Award-winning musical Hamilton, early in that show, the title character says, "As a kid in the Caribbean, I wished for a war. I knew that I was poor. I knew it was the only way to rise up. And if I just planted an earworm, I apologize. Stephen also references mandatory service in a peaceful setting, which I do believe would be a great thing in this country if it were ever to become politically palatable. And lastly, I appreciated once again Dr. Pinker's pointing out that optimism and pessimism are not simply mental mindsets. We're not hardwired to go around seeing always the best or worst, but rather we can take on a positive and hopeful outlook simply by looking at empirical data, facts, and trends. And as I mentioned earlier, Steven Pinker does this brilliantly in his 2018 TED Talk, which I highly recommend. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Professor Steven Pinker, and I look forward to hearing your reactions to it. To that end, please consider leaving ratings or reviews for this podcast series, and also think about subscribing so you won't miss any future episodes. And if you enjoy this kind of content, I hope you'll follow the Optimism Institute on social media. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.